Lisa Brown, what do you think of this ruling by the court that the state's not fulfilling its paramount duty to provide basic education means, particularly about what you have done as a political leader?
Well, the Constitution says that the legislature should fund amply basic education, and the legislature defines basic education. So we could solve the problem by defining basic education in a very narrow and ungenerous way, and the constitutional issue would be solved. Being Washington State, that's not where we're headed. We've defined basic education. I think we've tried to be very comprehensive about how we define basic education. We've expanded the definition of basic education, not because we don't see the writing on the wall, but people have very good intentions about wanting that definition to really meet the needs of all students. However, I'm back to that structural problem again. I do not believe that structurally we are funding that definition. I believe we've thinned the soup over the time I've been in the legislature. Am I happy about that? No. With the competing needs of higher education and the other things that state government does, and the limited resources falling from 11th compared to other states to 35th, we have thinned the soup. And I believe we need to take corrective action. And I'll say that with all due respect to both of our gubernatorial candidates, I think the idea that we can do it by just reprioritizing, after we've spent 4 years reprioritizing $20 billion worth of cuts, I think once they get in there and see it, they're going to find that that challenge is beyond reprioritization.
And I want to get back to that. You guys know budgets, and these gubernatorial candidates are making a lot of statements about budgets, and I want to hear your frank comments on that. But to the point that Joe Zarelli was making a little bit earlier, it sounds as though he feels as though the state should be taking more responsibility for figuring out how these dollars are being spent and that they're being spent effectively. Do you agree with that?
I agree. I believe that what we have done in the last few years, although you can't actually see much of it yet, is that we've developed a very good prototypical school model, a funding model that local school districts should be able, people in local school districts should be able to look at and say, are we funding according to this prototypical model? And so I believe that work has been done. I think the control needs to stay at the local level. Frankly, I don't think there's the same level of dissatisfaction with public schools in Spokane that there is in some parts of the state. I will tell you that there is differential educational outcomes, very highly correlated with incomes. The schools with the highest free and reduced lunch and the highest limited English proficiency have the lowest test scores, and I think we've got to confront that particular issue if we want to improve outcomes, and we do want to improve outcomes, and that's not a Democrat or a Republican desire. It's a desire we mutually share.
Okay, but we will elect a Democrat or a Republican to the governor's office this November. Give me your frank evaluation, expand on your frank evaluation. You said neither of them were talking straight when it comes to more money for education.
I didn't necessarily say they weren't talking straight. I said that I think once they see what we have seen and go through the process that we have gone through, and maybe Joe disagrees with me, but we've spent 4 years managing $20 billion worth of reductions. And I've gone through a series of reforms I'm very proud of in the correction system, closing 3 prisons, things that were worked on in a bipartisan way to consolidate back office functions in state government. I mean, you could devote a whole boring show to reforms that have already occurred. I don't think you're going to find the billion to however many billion that it's going to require to fully fund our definition of basic education by simply reprioritizing and reforming the existing general fund.
And who's saying they're just going to reprioritize to get all this money?
Well, what I think I've heard the gubernatorial candidates say is they don't believe we need to raise more revenue to get there. And so I'm just looking at the options. If you don't need to raise more revenue, then you need to cut. And, of course, reforms that get you better outcomes with less funds. But I'm saying I don't see billions of dollars of that, even if we had a one-person government and it was Joe Zarelli. Sorry.
We'd have fewer problems.
Or a one-person government that was Lisa Brown. I don't think either one of us could get there.
What about that, Joe Zarelli?
Well,
do you think the gubernatorial candidates are speaking straight, do you think can they accomplish what they say they can do by not raising revenue to get where we need to get when it comes to education?
It depends on the timeline that you're shooting for. What's your plan? And to me, it's the approach. How do we get to where we need to be? And if you think anybody can come in and just fix the problem and increase funding by $1, $2, $3 billion in education, it's not going to happen. But you could set up through how we do fund and pay things through a priorities approach to start over time getting more money into education. The Constitution has a higher legal expectation to fulfillment than the creation and annual changes in the law and policy that the legislature makes, I would hope. So if we're going to argue, as the court has presented to us, and the case was made to them, that we have a greater responsibility to K-12 education per the Constitution than anything else state government does, why is it that we don't defend and fund education in a way that takes care of that responsibility first? And then whether you need more money or not, all things fall after that. In other words, why don't we have a higher requirement to deal with that issue? We don't. As Senator Brown indicated, all things are equal. If we went out and found $1 billion more in money, I guarantee you most of that would be eaten up in other programs that people want to spend money on. There's a great demand for dollars in a lot of different areas. So by simply increasing revenue to the state will in no way guarantee more money into K-12. That's why I think one of the things Rob's presented, and we've talked about in the legislature, is to set a growth in spending on all areas of government outside of K-12 education. If K-12 education is our priority, then it ought to be able to grow commensurate with the budget as a piece of it, unfettered as much as possible. The other areas of government ought to have some type of a growth cap on them that would allow us then to put more money into K-12 education, and that then the legislature is declaring its priority per its constitutional responsibility. So I think that is something specific that Rob has put out there that makes a lot of sense, and it goes exactly as the Constitution presents the problem to the legislature, and that is as a priority.
I want to follow up on that, but I know there are other questions we have on some cards. If there are other questions from you that you wanted to pass out and bring up, I can take a look at those too. I don't want to totally dominate the conversation here, but
Can I give you a quick response to that?
Yes, please do.
Well, I think that's making it easier than it really is. It makes it sound easier than it really is. What a so-called growth cap on other areas of government means is that you are going to be cutting in other areas of government. You're going to be cutting developmental disability kids that get to transition from high school into employment programs, or nursing home rates, or child care subsidies, and those other, or higher education, which we know has already been dramatically slashed in terms of state support. And so it sounds good to say we're just going to do it by a formula. Education's going to get what it needs, and everything else is going to live with the cap. But everything else is growing too. There are more college kids, more families with special needs kids, et cetera, et cetera. And you're essentially disguising or not talking about the cuts that will have to be made there if you don't let those areas grow along with the population and the needs of the programs. And I'm not talking about expansions of state government into new areas. I'm talking about keeping pace with what we currently do, which I don't think anybody thinks we have an overly generous social safety net. We have an adequate one. We want to keep pace. It will have to grow, and if it doesn't grow, we will have to make cuts.
I believe that's just not true. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is a cap on all areas of non-K-12 spending, or K-12 and higher ed is his proposal, and I would agree with that, because the higher ed piece it's a continuum that's important, that solves a lot of the other problems that Senator Brown is talking about. If you give the resources to get kids through education, get them through higher education, better the chance that the problems that require then at the back end for us to pay for become more and more likely, because people are getting what they need to be self-sufficient in the education area. But not only that, the cap you'd be talking about is what government grows on average in these areas, 3% a year. We can live with that in these areas. The thing that gets stymied a little bit is other new ideas about new programs. And what it would do is, in the first 4 years of our current governor's term in office, we saw 32% revenue growth over that 4-year period. 32%. And we did not increase the funding for education. 32% revenue growth in that period of time, and all the money went to other areas of the budget and new ideas. The legislature is incapable of fulfilling its constitutional responsibility to education because there's too much desire to do other things that compete against education that get in the way. So we need something like this, or you'll never see it, even if you go out and raise taxes.
Other things, childcare and early learning for pre-K kids, without which we're not going to have success in our K-12 system. Other things is elderly citizens receiving home care services, and that we know that demographically that part of our population is growing faster. So the idea that we utilize the revenue to do a bunch of new things is just not accurate. We actually presided over a downturn in revenue related to our private economy or related to the number of people requiring services, and we allocated essentially the pain over that large group of functions that state government's involved in. And I know people don't walk down the street saying government when they think about, an elderly relative in a nursing home, but state government, nursing homes could not make it without the payments made to nursing homes. And our vast array of things out there that keep the public safe and healthy, state government has a part to play in all that.
You talked about the state government, the legislature, and the initiative process as this whole big third thing out there. What do you think of the initiative process, and what would you most like to see changed in it, if anything?
It's in the Constitution, and I respect it. And ironically, I came to Washington State because I was very excited about working on an environmental initiative. So it's ironic that it's become challenging for me as a state legislator, but it's a fact of our political life, and I wouldn't try to change the initiative process except to say that it's really unfortunate that what was originally a populist way to have citizens have a way to deal with special interests who were controlling the legislature, you now have special interests that get very involved in funding the initiative process. And sometimes they give up on the legislative process and don't try to work their way through a compromise with the people they disagree with because they figure they can raise the money and put an initiative on the ballot.
Do you agree with that, Joe Zarelli?
I think the initiative process can be worked for good and for bad. On the one hand, you mentioned earlier in our conversation about the school initiatives that were passed. We did the same thing. Senator Brown just mentioned health care and the whole idea of home care, which is a huge growing piece of our budget that came to us via an initiative and really never told the truth to the public about it, how much it was going to cost us and really what they're getting for it. And that's been passed a couple of times. And then you go back to the school initiatives, which made sense, but the billions of dollars that they would cost, nobody presented an idea on how to pay for them. So all you're doing then is presenting a priority, hopefully via the initiative process, without the knowledge of how budgets are put together from the public, and saying, we want you to spend money on this, not realizing, well, that's going to have to come out of education somewhere else or out of the elderly programs or something. But at the end of the day, the legislature can correct any initiative after 2 years. We can fix it. And that's typically what we've had to do on many initiatives. And if we agree that it needs to be fixed, then both parties could come together and do it. We did that with the property tax initiative several years ago. We came in, I think it was even in a special session, and we fixed an initiative because we knew it was the right thing, doing what the public wanted. Again, it's up to us as leaders to realize that the people are telling us something and do about it, not be combative about what they want. That's how we're there on education. The two initiatives, we finally agreed that this doesn't make sense to have this separate funding, but what we need to do is overall, the message really is, we've got to find a better priority for how we pay for education. We've got to do that, so we need to make the commitment to do that. That was the message from the voters. And I think you have a similar situation with the 2/3 vote. The legislature can change it, And the public has the right to pass an initiative.
And they do.
And they
Both.
do every year, every year. So I don't know what the court's going to intervene on when the legislature can change it anytime they want, except for those first 2 years, and the public keeps passing it. So I don't know what there is to rule on, in my opinion.
Speaking of initiatives, Washington voters might legalize marijuana for adult use this fall. Would the state be able to collect taxes on something prohibited by the federal government? And just generally, what do you think of that initiative, Joe?
I would imagine we can collect taxes on it. I don't know how that whole legal thing comes together. You know, that's something that was passed by the public several years ago, and we've never gotten right. I've actually voted for some of the changes and found out those aren't going to work. I'm pretty confused about what will work at this point. Never really having a thorough discussion about it, or really just never being involved in it. You know, I think we're at a point where the legislature is going to have to come to the reality that we're going to have to fix the problem on how we deal with this in the public domain. But I don't know where they go with it. We've tried to fix it the last 3 years, and
Right.
every time we're told this will work, and unless you're deep involved in that particular policy area,
This is a
it's
whole
hard to
other
tell how it's
thing,
gonna
isn't it?
work
We're
out.
talking about legalizing marijuana use for all adults, not just medical marijuana. I mean, it seems like it's a much broader initiative.
Yeah, I don't think I would agree or support a move to make it totally legal. No.
What kind of situation are we going to be come November if this passes, Lisa Brown?
Well, I endorse the initiative. I don't know that answers all the difficult questions that need to be answered, especially in relationship to federal laws that conflict with state laws. So I guess the next legislature, which neither of us will be part of, will get to grapple with that. I do believe that we've inappropriately spent lots of resources incarcerating and inequitably incarcerating, because the statistics show a lot of people of color, incarcerating them over marijuana use, and that we've got a thriving black market that will exist whether or not we accommodate it legally or not. And the case was made for me to endorse the initiative this time. And I don't think that solves all of our problems, although I do think that revenue would be raised that could be utilized productively in the state.
Yeah, the question is, does it create more problems than it solves?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's why I'm a fan of the legislative process, because as something works its way through that process, you definitely hear about problems that you don't hear about when you read one sentence on an initiative or a referendum. It basically says yes or no, and the fine print, I think very few people get to read, and the options for modifying it are not there. That's why I like the legislative process better.
Well, and the legislature, as Joe Zarelli just explained, can change initiatives a couple years down the road. Could the
Yes.
legislature change the marijuana initiative a couple years down the road?
We could change it with a supermajority in the first year after it's passed. The legislature has the right to change an initiative with a supermajority. That's laid out in the Constitution. After 2 years, it becomes a regular law subject to amendment by the legislature.
Adam, who's a UW graduate and professional student, member of the Professional Student Senate, asks, there seems to be a growing agreement that funding higher education needs to be made a higher priority again. So how do we get there? In your mind, what does the future of higher education in Washington look like, and how do we get there? Lisa Brown?
I think we have gone as far as we can with these rapid tuition increases, which have been necessitated by the state withdrawing support. When I came into the legislature, and I come in from a higher education background and still teach in higher education, we were providing almost 2/3 of the cost of undergraduate student's tuition. Now it's down to about 1/3, varies across how you measure it. But I think that's as far as it should go. And in fact, I would like to see us enhance support for higher education. How do you get there? That is the very difficult budgeting process that the legislature goes through. If you don't have more revenue, it means cutting somewhere else.
Joe, do you agree that we need more funding for higher education? And if so, how do we get there?
I do, but I'm a little different in this area. I've argued the last several years for a complete change in how we do financial aid and support for students. You know, it's the only area of government where we subsidize every student regardless of their ability or capability. In other words, what I'm saying, you can come from a household of $20,000 a year or a household of $1 million a year, and we subsidize those students the same. Now, one obviously is still going to have debt because the amount of money we're subsidizing to has continually dropped. And it's something I've never understand specifically with Democrats why they don't argue against, because that's kind of been a little bit of the mantra of Democrats is to have that helping hand or more of that safety net for people of need. In this case, we pay for everybody, whoever shows up. And I think we need to change that. I think we need to look more at what the ability of people is to pay for their own education and take more of a market approach from the school or institution perspective, and then take that money that those that can pay more for their own education and put that back into the financial aid model so that you can do more for the lower income households and do hopefully more into the middle class area, so you're covering a larger pool of students, because it's really the middle class that gets killed in this model that we have. Obviously, if you're in a wealthy household, you're paying for the education regardless of the financial or the subsidy that's built into the tuition policy. If you're poor, you tend to get more access to grants and other things that help you get through. If you're middle class, mom and dad make a few bucks but can't pay for your education, it's all about debt. I think the model, regardless of what the tuition or state support is, it'll never change those sets of dynamics, and I think we'll always have a problem regardless of the state support that is more injurious to the middle class, which is the piece that we need to make work in this model.
This is a question about poverty, which this person says is a major factor associated with a lot of bad outcomes. There's been a significant increase in the number of children living in poverty since 2009. The national poverty figures out are alarming. What should the legislature do, if anything, to reduce poverty in the state of Washington? Joe Zarelli.
We need to make jobs more readily available, and that's a national and a state issue, and it's not about government spending money to artificially create an opportunity for a job that's of a short-term nature. It's about doing things that help make the economy work better so that people have an opportunity to find work. And a big piece of it is what we've been talking about tonight, is making sure that the students who do graduate from high school are either ready to go into some type of a career training program or can go to college without remedial help that too many students find to even get into college or can't get into college or into that training program for the career that they're seeking. But the most important thing is to have the opportunity in the marketplace for those things.
Lisa Brown, do you agree that more opportunity in the marketplace would help reduce poverty?
I agree that jobs and economic growth can help reduce poverty. I don't think that's the only barrier, but there are important things I think that state government can do to be a partner in job creation. I think infrastructure is very key, and transportation infrastructure and physical infrastructure so that business can operate is something state government really needs to be a partner in. Second, education. And again, I would say that we should go beyond our constitutional obligation in K-12, and that the early learning portion of education is absolutely essential to combating poverty. We know that programs that deal with maternal health and the early life of a child raise their potential dramatically, and those resources have a huge return on investment. And then back to higher education, there's nothing that increases people's mobility or helps them realize their potential as does higher education. And the statistics bear that out. My own life is a testament to that. Wouldn't be sitting here today without the Illinois basic education program that enabled me to go to college. And so education and infrastructure is definitely something state government needs to be involved in to combat poverty.
I'm going to direct this to you, Lisa Brown. This is from Twitter. What do you think are the most politically viable sources of funding in the upcoming session? I assume that means additional funding. Oh,
additional revenue? Well, I don't think, if you mean by politically viable, right, there's a couple different ways to look at that. Does the public support it? Can you get the votes in the legislature? I would mention that there are some surcharges that we put in place that could potentially be continued but that's a 2/3 vote under the current situation. I think there's other tax breaks that aren't as important as more investment in education, but that would take a 2/3 vote. If politically viable means getting to 2/3, sorry, I think that's going to be very tough.